Good morning, Grace and friends. Today's sermon is Esther, Hero of Wisdom and Courage. The sermon is dedicated to the extraordinary leadership of women all over the world these last 2 challenging years, local, state, national, and across the globe. The book of Esther has not always been popular in Christian scholarly circles. Some question whether it should be in the Bible. It's a bit racy and more than a bit violent. But the biggest reason is that God's name is not mentioned one time in the book. The king's name 190 times, God's 0. But the unseen hand of God is evident throughout, principally through the courage and wisdom of Esther and her foster father Mordecai. This book is so important to the Jews that it is featured and read every year at the annual festival of Purim, one of the 5 great Jewish festivals. You will see why. At the festival of Purim, the whole story is read, and every time the evil villain Haman's name is read, the children are given the role of jeering and hissing his name, Haman, Haman. The book is like a grand opera, or it is like those early black and white movie melodramas. The opening scene is a banquet. There are banquets throughout the book. King Ahasuerus threw a feast for his officials in the palace of Susa. It lasted 180 days. The king fancied parties, especially if the wine was flowing. Then immediately following, there was another party, another feast for all the citizens of Susa, which lasted 7 days. All the men were in one great hall, a kind of stag party, and all the women were in another hall with Queen Vashti. On the 7th day of the party, when the king was, as the text says, pardon me again, merry with wine, read, sloshed, he sent for Queen Vashti to come parade her queenly beauty before the men. She was to wear her crown. That was probably all she was to wear. Vashti refused. She refused to be sexually exploited, as women throughout the centuries have been. She would have none of it. The king exploded in anger. He went to his chamberlain, his chief advisor, and asked what he should do. The chamberlain said that Queen Vashti had set a terrible example for the wives and women of the kingdom. If a queen could refuse the king, the whole social fabric would unravel. So he advised the king to banish her as queen. The advice pleased the king, and he did. Pardon me again. The chamberlain had another idea that pleased the king. There would be throughout the nation a great queen hunt. The finalists would be brought to Susa, given a year's beauty treatment at the king's royal spa, then presented to the king for him to choose as his queen. Scene 2, the great queen hunt. Now Mordecai enters the stage. He had become the foster father of a young orphan girl named Esther. He brought her up as his own daughter and raised her up in the Hebrew faith. When the finalists were assembled, Esther was among them. Mordecai went to visit her daily at the spa to see how she was doing. The list of finalists was whittled down to 7. And when Esther appeared before the king, the contest was over. Esther would be his queen. And he called for a feast, another feast called the Great Queen's Feast. Mordecai privately counseled Esther at this point not to reveal her Jewishness to the king. A most wise decision, as we shall see. Mordecai had an official position at the king's gate. One day he overheard a plot to overthrow the king led by two of the king's inner circle. Mordecai told Esther of the plot, who then told the king. The plot was foiled. The two leaders were hanged, and all of this is recorded in the king's chronicle, including Mordecai's role in reporting the insurrection afoot. Scene 3, an obscene decree. After the palace shakeup, the king raised up a man named Haman to be his chief prince. It was a horrendous choice. Haman asked the king to set up a law that everybody in the kingdom had to bow down to him as he passed. Mordecai refused to do so. His Hebrew faith forbade him to bow to anyone but God. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow to him, he flew into a fury. His first thought was to have Mordecai killed. Then he had another more insidious thought. Why not kill all the Jews in the kingdom? Evil always overreaches. And if unopposed, holocausts happen. Haman went to the king with his evil plan. With a voice full of racist innuendo and malice, he appealed to the king's paranoia. There is a certain people scattered throughout the kingdom, he said. Their laws and customs are different from everybody else's. They are dangerous to the kingdom. It does not profit the king to tolerate them. So if it pleases the king, let us issue a decree to destroy them and pay 10,000 talents to those who would carry out the king's decree. The idea did please the king. Paranoid and dim-witted Ahasuerus, and he said, the royal treasury is yours. And he put a signet ring on Haman's finger and said, do with them as you please. The day of execution was set. It is the date the Jews call now Purim. The decree went out. Hear the words. To destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children. And here's how this part of the story ends. The king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Susa was struck dumb. They knew in their bones something was wrong. We see why this story is so important to the Jews who have lived this kind of horror over and over in their history. And it should be important to Christians as well. We who should be the defenders of our Jewish siblings, but who too often have been on the side of the persecutors. The story is also a warning against the power of the state in all times to persecute people on the basis of race or religion. Scene 4, the young queen's crisis. When Mordecai heard the evil decree, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the streets as a public act of mourning, crying out against the decree. Esther's maid came to Esther and told her what her foster father was doing. Esther had not heard of the decree. It may seem strange, but the queen did not rule. She was more like the most favored of the king's harem. Esther tried to persuade Mordecai to stop and, in fact, sent him a new set of clothes to put on instead of his sackcloth and ashes. he refused the clothes. He sent her a copy of the decree and begged her to intervene on behalf of her people. Esther sent back her response. Anyone entering the king's chamber uninvited can be put to death. I have not been invited into his chamber for 30 days. Mordecai sent back his forceful reply. Do not think you shall escape in the king's palace any better than the rest of your people. And then he delivered the most famous words of the book. Who knows? Perhaps you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this, meaning come into your royal position for such a time as this. To this point in the story, Esther has been distinguished only by her beauty. Will she be more than just beautiful? Mordecai had raised her in the Hebrew faith with all of its moral virtues like courage and wisdom and justice and compassion. Would she act on any of these? Well, Esther said yes. She had come to the kingdom for such a time as this. She asked Mordecai to have all of her people fast and pray for her, and that she would do the same. I will go to the king's chamber, she said. If I perish, I perish. Someone has said, courage is fear that has said its prayers. As she approached the king's chamber, the king welcomed her into his presence. Her life was spared, but there was far more for her to do, again at the risk of her own life. The king, happy to see her, said, whatever you request, I will grant up to half of my kingdom. Esther's strategic plan to save her people was now set in motion. She delayed her request and said she would make it the next day at dinner and to invite Haman to be there with them. Haman was thrilled. What an auspicious occasion. The king, the queen, and I. But again, Esther delayed her request. She would do it at the next dinner together. Haman left feeling pretty full of himself, but then he saw the insolent Mordecai again refusing to bow down to him, and he flew into a rage. He went home and talked to his wife about the great insult, and they concocted a plan to have Mordecai hanged in the center of the city. The gallows was built 50 cubits high. Noah's Ark was only 30 cubits high. It was like putting an electric chair atop the county courthouse. Scene 5, the tables turned. That night the king had trouble getting to sleep. He asked the servant to come read the king's chronicles to him to help him sleep. That's even better than a sermon. As the servant read the part about the plot to overthrow him, he discovered that Mordecai had been the one to report the plot. The next day, he called Haman in. He asked Haman what should be done for a man whom the king wishes to honor. Haman, of course, thought the king was talking about him. You're so vain, you probably think this parade is about you. Haman answered, put the king's robe on him and create a parade and honor him throughout the streets of the city. The king said, very good. Now go put the king's robe on Mordecai. Mordecai? Haman was mortified. Now came the last dinner of the three, the king, the queen, and Haman. Esther had shrewdly delayed her request. Now was the time. and now she, for the first time, revealed her identity as a Jew. "If I have found favor in your sight," she said, "then let my life be given me and the lives of my people." The king dim-wittedly had forgotten about the decree he signed to kill all the Jews. "Well, who would presume to do such a thing?" he asked. And Esther said, "He is seated across the table, Haman." And here's how the story ends. Haman is hanged on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. And Mordecai is given the king's parade that Haman thought was going to be for him. King Ahasuerus could not undo the decree he had signed, but he gave the Jews the legal right to self-defense. When the day of the extermination came, the Jews turned back the mercenaries and were saved. Human evil in history is not always so easily overcome. But God's unseen hand is at work, sometimes through people like us. Our faith sings, "Though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet." Here are some takeaways for me as I preach this story again. First, human evil is real, and we see it everywhere in many degrees. Holocausts, gulags, the slavery of an entire race of people for 250 years in our nation, the demonization of immigrants, the evil of systemic racism built into our institutions and laws. But God's unseen hand is still at work. And this, God needs our human hands to resist evil and defeat it. As Edmund Burke said, "The only thing for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner, has said, "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." And this, there is an Esther and Mordecai in us all. Their wisdom and courage can be ours because these are the gifts of the Spirit of God within us. God works in surprising ways through surprising people. One of the most beloved hymns of the 20th century was written by Harry Emerson Fosdick, the minister at the Riverside Church in New York City. He wrote it following World War I. Here are the words. "God of grace and God of glory, on thy people pour thy power. Crown the ancient church's story, bring its bud to glorious flower. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour, for the facing of this hour. Lo, the hosts of evil round us, scorn thy Christ, assail his ways. From the fears that long have bound us, free our hearts to love and praise. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days, for the living of these days." And now this last stanza. "Heal your children's warring madness, bend our pride to your control. Shame our wanton, selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal. Amen."